So in part one of this video, I left off saying we want you to be a better writer. I want you to be a better writer and write so that every single word, every single sentence has a high degree of meaning, that it's part of your argument, part of your analysis. How do you get there? By paying close attention to what good writers do, how they structure their writing. There are lots of ways to do it. There are many different types of good writers. To be a good writer, you need to be a better reader, and you need to be a good close reader. Okay, so ostrich eggs. The late Pleistocene was a rich time for the people of Asia. Snyder goes on to give us evidence. He's giving us concrete evidence and discussing, right, what's happening in China. And it's a very different place, right, as you would expect. Just as in Cave of Forgotten Dreams, that part of France is very different. There are elephants, right? There are rhinoceros. There are bison. There were all of these animals that you can't find because some of them are extinct. But you can also only find, say, in zoos now. So we're moving now into the Mesolithic, the Middle Stone Age. We're getting closer to the present. To talk about the Neolithic, which is the real subject of his essay, because he's trying to make an argument about the Neolithic being a time when human beings, in his view, were optimally in balance with nature. Now that might seem strange again. Is he saying get rid of all of this civilization and go back to the Stone Age? I don't think that's his argument. I think he's making an argument about a way of seeing the world and understanding the world that comes from that time, and that is in large part embodied in Taoism, philosophical Taoism, and arguing that we need to or should learn from that in thinking about how we order our civilization moving forward. So it's an interesting section. I mean, he's got these great phrases, and if you're doing close reading, look for interesting language. For interesting language, for instance, I would point to archaic internationalism. This archaic internationalism has been long lost to China and civilized Japan, but for those who have eyes and ears, it is still present in tiny spots in North America. What's he talking about? This idea of archaic internationalism is really interesting, because again, it proposes that long ago, in the late Pleistocene, it makes sense to think of something called internationalism. People traveling great distances and sharing and engaging in trade, exchanging ideas. And of course, that's how things have worked in the past. It's just at a slower rate than the present, and in a way that's less destructive to the non-human natural world. Okay, so this next section, millet. What's going on? We could take a quick look. We see another list, and we see that there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 paragraphs, including that block quote with the list. Let's look at the topic sentence of the first paragraph. Civilized China has its roots in the Neolithic villages along the Huang River Valley, especially at the place where the Huang River takes a sharp turn north, and the Wei and Lo and Fen rivers join it. Okay, so he's now establishing a topic of transitioning from the Paleolithic to Neolithic villages. We're moving forward in time, and we're still thinking about civilized China, which comes later. And if you're doing a close reading by now, you recognize that civilization isn't necessarily a good thing, certainly not with regard to, and this is Snyder's argument, we've already seen it, not with regard to a good balance with nature, right? We can go back to this, and we see civilized societies inevitably have a harsh effect on the national environment, which means that civilized China and its harsh effect on the environment have their roots in these villages, in his view. Right? What happens? He, again, walks us through the evidence of how these people lived and how they developed, and he makes an interesting argument here. After going through this list of what these people lived like, what the archaeological evidence shows us their lives were like. And he writes, these already sophisticated, stable villages are witness to a way of life in place of great attention and care that antedates their archaeological dates by several thousand years. They are already, by 4000 BC, fine expressions of the possibilities of the Yellow River watershed bioregion. This is an interesting point in his argument. You have to think along with your reader. What else is happening around 4,000 years BC? What is this essay arguing? The other thing that he's arguing in this essay, as we'll see, is that this is about the time that the oral traditions and the collective philosophy that comes together in Lao Tzu and then finds further expression in Zhuangzi and Liezi. In other words, philosophical Taoism is really taking shape. And it's a philosophy that is one of great attention and care to the place in which these people live. A very natural environment from our standpoint today, right? One that in many ways would strike us as primitive, but that Snyder is arguing in certain respects is better. Certainly with respect to human relations with the non-human natural world, even as we recognize we're already at a point where human beings are starting to change the planet in a way that culminates in the Anthropocene. Now this is where things get very intense. This section is called Writing and Slaves. So we've gone from ostrich eggs, which you go out and find, you forage, to millet, which you cultivate. And now we're talking about writing and slaves. This is a big leap. If you're a reader and a close reader, watch out for these kinds of big leaps. If you hit something and go, what the hell is he talking about? What? What does that have to do with that? Either be patient and read to find out, or start thinking about it yourself, make some connections. These are always good signs that something interesting is happening if you're dealing with a good writer. So, again, civilization, a word which generally has a very positive connotation, in this case, is a word that signals great harm to the natural world. So we want to recognize that this word is part of Snyder's core argument. There's something about civilization, human civilization, at scale. The bigger it gets, the more harm it does to the non-human natural world. That is a problem. We'll keep reading and see if he proposes any solutions to that problem. Now we're really entering the period that we think of as history or historical, because it's written. There is written record, not just a bunch of archaeological sort of evidence that we have to do some speculation about or create a narrative by interpreting multiple finds across many sites to form hypotheses that allow us to form hypotheses of the kind we saw the scientists making in Cave of Forgotten Dreams in many instances. How do these people live? Can we compare them to any contemporary cultures and learn from that? Can we compare these findings to findings elsewhere and learn from that? Can we see what we recognize in what these people created and learn from that? Now we're in a period where these people are writing about their own societies. At least some people are writing about them, right? Educated, elite generally. So the first civilization is called Shang. Note that he says the traits of this civilization are discontinuous with the Neolithic. There's a class system, peasant class, large numbers of apparent slaves, a warrior clan class, aristocratic warrior clans who rule, and this increasing development of technology, much of it dedicated toward warfare, horse and chariot, weapons, and the intensification of industry. This is a great change in many ways, he writes. How a self-sustaining free people can be made into a serf or slave populace whose hard-earned surplus is taken by force to support a large class of non-producers is perhaps the major question of history. Let's stop there for a moment again. If you're a close reader and a writer says, this is a major question, or the major question of history, pay attention. You'd better highlight that. It's a claim. It's an argument. It's not one that you have to accept as given. You look at the evidence that the writer presents in support of that claim, and you begin to enter the conversation with that writer, whether you agree or disagree to one degree or another, or not. So here Snyder's making a big claim. This is where history starts. Scare quotes, so-called history, because there's history before this, in a sense, that we ignore or don't see the argument would go. And he says it's not an auspicious beginning. Now, let's think about how this argument progresses. He begins to make comparisons to our present day. Slavery as the fossil fuel of the second millennium. Bronze, the uranium. And here uranium as a fuel for nuclear power, but more importantly, as the explosive core of a nuclear device, a nuclear weapon. So we'll end this part of our video here for a couple of reasons. One is we end with the idea of the nuclear weapon, which is a feature of the mid-20th century starting point of the Anthropocene. But another is because we're running out of time for this clip. And I also wanted to stop and say what I'm doing here is also good for skimming. If you're doing research, reading for the larger structure, looking at the topic sentences of your paragraphs, to see how the argument moves. And once you decide then to use an article, you can go in and do that close reading that we're talking about here. All right, more in the next part of this video.